In recent years, we have seen a push to step away from fossil fuels and toward the harnessing of clean energy, such as wind and solar, as independent variables for our energy needs. And although I do agree clean energy is important, I believe being energy independent supersedes the perceived importance of clean energy technology. The fundamental reason why clean energy is being pushed so forcefully is due to the misconception that without clean energy, our planet will be destroyed in a matter of years due to climate change. I will not get into climate change in this video, but I will say that climate change is real. It has been happening for millions of years, long before we got here, and it will continue long after we're gone. However, climate change projections are rarely accurate. They are constantly being modified as new information comes in, which causes a lot of inaccuracies in the future projections. The question becomes, if climate change scientists can't accurately predict climate projections a year from now, or even a month from now, how can we trust them to accurately predict climate projections 100 years from now? That being said, these inconsistencies don't mean that climate change is untrue, nor does it mean that various types of industries, such as fossil fuels, don't have negative effects on the environment. It's also interesting to note that nuclear energy is far cleaner than fossil fuels and is far more efficient than all other forms of energy. So if we truly want clean energy with very little harmful emissions, then we should begin harnessing nuclear energy, since nuclear power plants emit absolutely no carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, or sulfur dioxides. But we'll get to that later. So back to the topic at hand. Instead of choosing a side between fossil fuels versus solar energy, or natural gas versus wind energy, etc., I would rather we implement all forms of technology to utilize all forms of energy. This is how we can truly be energy independent. Then, once we reach energy independence, we could continue the conversation on whether or not we should continue the use of fossil fuels. It should be noted, however, that with new technology in engineering, such as coal gasification, it is becoming more and more possible to use coal without emitting harmful gases to the atmosphere. Clean coal technology is no longer a theory. It is becoming more and more pragmatic as time goes on. But the best way to kick things into gear, as they say, to put us on the path to energy independence would be to discuss the elephant in the room.
First, we need to acknowledge the elephant in the room.
Nuclear energy. Many people hear the word nuclear and they right away think of Chernobyl, or they think of Fukushima in Japan, or that a nuclear energy site would be a haven for terrorists to flock to. Some even believe that a nuclear power plant has the capability to create a nuclear detonation, similar to that of an atomic weapon. Well, these beliefs are fallacies. They are not true, for the most part. Nobody can say for certain if another Chernobyl will happen, but it's not as likely as people are led to believe. In fact, nuclear energy ranks lowest in death per energy unit, even including the resulting deaths from nuclear spills such as Chernobyl and Fukushima. Moreover, a 2013 NASA study concluded that nuclear power prevented, quote, an average of 1.84 million air pollution-related deaths and 64 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gas emissions that would have resulted from fossil fuel burning, end quote. It's interesting to note that although the waste product of nuclear energy is radioactive, it is stored away from the general public, whereas emissions from fossil fuels are dispersed directly into the air we breathe. So the question becomes, would you rather have dangerous stuff be put into the ground away from the general public, or would you rather have lots and lots of dangerous stuff be put into the air we breathe? There is a lot of information to go over, since there are tons of ways to harness nuclear energy. So instead of going over the engineering aspects in detail, which will get very intense, I will cover a couple of different reactors that could be used today. But before we go there, we have to understand why there is so much fear and reticence regarding nuclear energy. So let's go over some of the reservations and myths people have regarding nuclear energy and see if investing in nuclear energy is worth it from an economic and environmental concern. The two major nuclear disasters people are most familiar with are the Fukushima and Chernobyl disasters. Chernobyl happened in 1986 in the Soviet Union, and Fukushima happened in 2011 in Japan. There's no need to sugarcoat it. Both had devastating effects we are still seeing today. These images are disturbing, and I can understand why there is a fear of nuclear energy. Imagine if this happened in a major city. Imagine if this happened in your city. It's terrifying to imagine it, but you cannot allow fear to dictate your actions and decisions. This is why I have a problem whenever the topic of gun control comes up, since the whole push for gun control is based on emotion and not facts. And in order to make the right decisions regarding public policy, you have to view things from an objective standpoint. But I digress. The fact is that the reason nuclear energy is feared so badly is due to these isolated incidents. Chernobyl happened due to poor process control. It did not need to happen, and it could have been prevented. According to Bela Liptak, who is an expert in nuclear power safety, automation, process control and optimization, as well as editor-in-chief of the Instrument and Automation of Engineers Handbook, and who studied the Chernobyl incident in great detail, said that, quote, "This accident occurred at night, after a shift change of operators who were poorly trained, uninformed, and were operating the plant under manual control while their safety controls were bypassed. Ironically, the Chernobyl accident occurred during a test run, which was conducted to improve plant safety. This accident proved once more what experienced control engineers have all learned, that a process must be understood before it can be controlled." His research concluded that the test was performed in the middle of the night by an unexperienced crew while the control computer was disabled. The operators were not properly trained on the possible reactivity that would happen when trying to stop any type of potential spill. Moreover, there were no engineers on site that understood the process and that could have prevented the operators from making the situation catastrophic. To quote Mr. Liptak again, "I cannot possibly list all of the errors in the process control system because practically none was provided. The lack of process control can be explained partly by the fact that the plant was built for military purposes and therefore was designed to operate at constant loading in a plutonium production mode. The second cause was the prevailing operating philosophy at that time in the Soviet Union, which did not trust automation and relied on operators who did not understand the process." Oh, so communism kills even more people. Just kidding, but seriously. Lastly, the plant design was poorly set up. The plant had no containment building, and, to quote Mr. Liptak one last time, the designers did not understand that once the core starts melting, the zirconium cladding will burn and thereby generate hydrogen as the oxygen in the steam is used up. In addition, they did not understand that the produced hydrogen will not only displace the cooling water and thereby reduce heat removal, but this extremely hot hydrogen will also quickly rise, increasing the pressure in the vapor space of the reactor. At Chernobyl, as this pressure increased, it lifted the top of the reactor, and as it entered the atmosphere, it formed oxyhydrogen, initiating a detonation. So in a nutshell, Chernobyl could have been prevented if safeguards were not ignored, if trained engineers were there, and if operators fully understood the process and how to handle a potential spill, and lastly, if communism didn't exist. You can find the link to his full assessment in the description below. Fukushima, not surprisingly, could have also been prevented, according to a recent study. In a peer-reviewed Philosophical Transactions A of the Royal Society, researchers from the USC Viterbi School of Engineering in California and the Middle East Technical University in Turkey researched thousands of documents relating to the Fukushima incident, ranging from news stories to government reports to industry reports and other relevant documents. The study concluded that the Fukushima spill was the result of arrogance and ignorance, design flaws, and that regulatory failures and improper hazard analysis doomed the plant before the tsunami even happened. One of the researchers of the study, Dr. Kolos Sanalakis, professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Southern California, said, quote, "While most studies have focused on the response to the accident, we found that there were design problems that led to the disaster that should have been dealt with long before the earthquake hit. Earlier government and industry studies focused on the mechanical failures and buried the lead. The pre-event tsunami hazard study, if done properly, would have identified the diesel generators as a linchpin of a future disaster. Fukushima Daiichi was a sitting duck waiting to be flooded. What doomed Fukushima Daiichi was the elevation of the EDGs, emergency diesel generators." The study also concluded that Tokyo Electric Power Company, aka TEPCO, which ran the plant, first reduced the height of the coastal cliffs where the plant was built. They underestimated potential tsunami heights, as well as relied on their own internal faulty data and incomplete modeling. They ignored warnings from Japanese scientists that larger tsunamis were possible. Moreover, TEPCO underestimated the possible rise in water level at Fukushima. They estimate the possible maximum rise in water level would be 6.1 meters, which was based on low-resolution studies of earthquakes of magnitude 7.5, despite the fact that 8.6 magnitude earthquakes had been recorded along the same coast the plant was located. There is a lot more to talk about regarding Fukushima, but I will leave it up to you if you want to dive deeper. The study itself is very long, but has a lot of pertinent information. Either way, both of these two major disasters not only could have been prevented, they should have been prevented. The incompetence of a few should not dictate the policies of a many. So now, we'll discuss some other characteristics of nuclear energy, such as greenhouse gas emissions, the cost of running a nuclear power plant, and the disposal and waste management of radioactive material. We will follow this up with a look at a couple different reactors that may become prominent in the near future and would allow us to harness nuclear energy in a very safe way. This graph delineates the different types of emissions produced for various electrical generation methods through the life cycle approach. The life cycle approach is a term used for the measurement of total emissions for all phases of the electrical generation process: construction, operation, and decommissioning. Decommissioning essentially means stopping production, or taking the plant out of service. As you can see, nuclear energy is on the way bottom of the graph. It also has the smallest gap of range between studies. It should be noted that the majority of greenhouse gas emissions from nuclear energy occurs during mining and fuel preparation, and not from the harnessing of energy itself. But what about the price? Does the cost of running a nuclear power plant outweigh the benefits of implementing nuclear energy? The construction of nuclear power plants are very expensive. In fact, the first generation of nuclear power plants proved so costly to build that half of them were abandoned during construction. It is estimated that 60% of overall costs come from the capital costs alone. Capital costs include overnight costs, construction and investment costs, as well as financing costs. These include costs relating to infrastructure, project management, construction, etc. These costs can range between $2 and $10 billion, which has made it hard to attract private investors. This is why there is a push to have the government and corporate funds for nuclear power plants in their yearly budget. Once the plant is up and running, however, the overall costs seem to reduce drastically. Once the plant is operational, the typical fuel costs of a nuclear power plant are typically about 1/3 to 1/2 of those for a coal-fired plant, and 1/4 and 1/5 for those for a gas combined cycle plant. The U.S. Nuclear Energy Institute suggests that the cost of fuel for a coal-fired plant is 78% of total costs. For a gas-fired plant, the figure is 87%, and for nuclear, the uranium is about 14%, or 34% if all front-end and waste management costs are included. These costs tend to drop even more as efficiency increases, leading to cost reduction. As an example, in Spain, the cost of nuclear electricity was reduced by 29% over the period of 1995 to 2001. Cost reductions of 40% were achieved by boosting enrichment levels and burnup. So, although the capital costs of nuclear power plants can be quite expensive, once they become operational, the plant operating costs tend to drop dramatically, and by tweaking engineering procedures, fuel costs, which are part of the operating costs, tend to drop even more. Okay, I'm getting tongue-tied now, so that's enough about money. Let's talk about the other major reservation people have over nuclear energy: waste disposal. It's no secret that radioactive waste is a very dangerous byproduct that can lead to serious malformations and death for those that come into contact with it. So what is being done now to manage waste disposal adequately? And should we be worried about any type of dangerous infestations that could harm the general public? Instead of me summarizing the details of nuclear waste disposal, let's just let the World Nuclear Association explain it for us. The most significant high-level waste from a nuclear reactor is the used nuclear fuel left after it has spent about 3 years in the reactor generating heat for electricity. Low-level waste is made up of lightly contaminated items like tools and work clothing from power plant operation and makes up the bulk of the radioactive waste. Items disposed of as intermediate-level waste might include used filters, steel components from within the reactor, and some effluents from reprocessing. Generating enough electricity for one person produces just 30 grams of used fuel each year. High-level wastes make just 3% of the total volume of waste arising from nuclear generation, but they contain 95% of the radioactivity arising from nuclear power. Low-level wastes represent 90% of the total volume of radioactive waste, but only contain 1% of the radioactivity. Used nuclear fuel is very hot and radioactive. Handling and storing it safely can be done as long as it is cooled and plant workers are shielded from the radiation it produces by a dense material like concrete or steel, or by a few meters of water. Water can conveniently provide both cooling and shielding, so a typical reactor will have its fuel removed underwater and transferred to a storage pool. After about 5 years, it can be transferred into dry ventilated concrete containers, but otherwise it can safely remain in the pool indefinitely, usually up to 50 years. Currently, the majority of used fuel is not recycled, but reprocessing used fuel to recover uranium and plutonium avoids the wastage of the valuable resource. Most of the used fuel, about 96%, is uranium, and up to 1% is plutonium, with the remaining 3 being high-level waste. Both reprocessed uranium and plutonium have been recycled into new fuel. Plutonium mixed with uranium in their oxide forms is known as mixed oxide fuel. The high-level waste, whether as used fuel after 50 years of cooling or the separated 3% of reprocessed fuel, will be disposed of deep underground in geological repositories. Intermediate and low-level wastes are disposed of closer to the surface in many established repositories. Low-level waste disposal sites are purpose-built, but are not much different from normal municipal waste sites. Nuclear power is not the only industry that creates radioactive waste. Other industries include medicine, particle and space research, oil and gas, and mining, to name just a few. Some of these materials are not produced inside a reactor, but rather are concentrated forms of naturally occurring radioactive material. Civil nuclear waste from nuclear power plants have never caused any harm, nor posed an environmental concern in over 50 years of the nuclear power industry. Their management and eventual disposal is straightforward. One characteristic of all radioactive waste, which distinguishes them from the very much larger amount of other toxic industrial waste, is that their radioactivity progressively decays and diminishes. For instance, after 40 years, the used fuel removed from a reactor has only 1/1000th of its initial radioactivity remaining, making it very much easier to handle and dispose of. The categorization, high, intermediate, and low, helps determine how wastes are treated and where they end up. High-level waste require shielding and cooling. Low-level waste can be handled easily without shielding. All radioactive waste facilities are designed with numerous layers of protection to make sure that people remain protected for as long as it takes for radioactivity to reduce to background levels. Low-level and intermediate wastes are buried close to the surface. For low-level waste disposal is not much different from a normal municipal landfill. High-level waste can remain highly radioactive for thousands of years. They need to be disposed of deep underground in engineered facilities built in stable geological formations. While no such facilities for high-level waste currently operate, their feasibility has been demonstrated, and there are several countries now in the process of designing and constructing them. Lastly, I want to talk about an alternative type of nuclear energy technology, and that is thorium-based nuclear energy. It has some characteristics synonymous with uranium, but whereas uranium produces plutonium, thorium does not. And as we know, plutonium is what you need to make nuclear weapons. But thorium has other characteristics that differ from uranium that make it, in my eyes, more beneficial, efficient, and safer. Thorium itself is an element discovered in the early 1800s. It is 3 to 4 times more common than uranium, with its major deposits still largely unused. So much so that up until recently, most mining operations just threw it out, since it appears to be common as dirt. According to the United Nations Nuclear Energy Organization, International Atomic Energy Agency, thorium is a safer alternative to uranium. It has more stability and has a higher resistance to radioactivity. Depending on the process being used, thorium can produce more energy and is thus more efficient than uranium-based reactors. Moreover, the ability for proliferation, aka production of nuclear weapons, drops exponentially when using thorium-filled nuclear reactors. Thorium can be used in a liquid fluoride thorium reactor, or LFTR, which is far safer than common uranium reactors. The reason why it's safer is since LFTR doesn't use water for cooling, there is no possibility for a hydrogen explosion, which is what happened at Fukushima. Thorium also emits alpha particles instead of gamma particles like uranium does, making it far less radioactive and far less harmful to humans and animals. Furthermore, thorium reactors use far less materials than your average uranium reactor, making it more cost-effective. Since the radioactive waste of thorium is far weaker than uranium, it only needs to be stored for roughly 300 years, as compared to uranium, which may need to be stored for thousands of years. So you may be asking, if thorium is so great, then why aren't we using it now? Well, in the 1950s, there was a debate over whether to use thorium or uranium for nuclear power plants. But since uranium can be easily harnessed into nuclear weapons and thorium cannot, which is what America wanted to create at the time, it was agreed that uranium would be more beneficial to the country as a whole. And since all of the nuclear power plants in America run on uranium today, the debate on whether to modify the plants to run thorium may be too costly. Thorium can also be used in molten salt reactors, which are reactors that cannot melt, that create extremely small amount of waste, and that are walk-away safe. Meaning, if the whole plant would just walk away one day, the reactor would just shut down by cooling itself off. As of now, China and India are currently leading the way into thorium-based nuclear energy. So even though thorium and uranium-based nuclear reactors seem like a gift from God, let me be clear. Nuclear energy is not without issues. It has pros and cons, just like every other piece of energy technology. But the question isn't whether or not it's safe. The question is whether or not it's any less safe than other forms of energy. And as we discovered in this video, it appears that it is no different than other forms of energy in terms of potential hazards. It is safer, cleaner, and more reliable than other major forms of energy technology we are currently using today. I believe we should be adopting nuclear energy technology into our daily lives, especially thorium-based nuclear energy. We could become energy independent in no time. It would create jobs, reduce electrical costs, and have positive effect on greenhouse gas emissions since it basically doesn't emit any harmful gases to the atmosphere. So in conclusion, If we really want energy independence and we want to achieve that with clean energy and not fossil fuels, then nuclear energy would be the way to go, especially due to it being the most efficient method of harnessing clean energy. If we wanted energy independence regardless of its source, then nuclear energy should be adopted in with other forms of energy, including fossil fuels. By using all forms of energy technology, the US and most countries could achieve energy independence in a matter of no time. The fact is that nuclear energy is the most reliable form of energy. Moreover, with the induction of thorium-based nuclear energy into the mainstream, we could harness a clean energy source that has a weak radioactive element, and using reactors such as a liquid fluoride thorium reactor or an integral molten salt reactor, the negative consequences of a freak spill would be drastically reduced. The reason nuclear energy is feared is because of pictures like these, and I understand that, but we have covered how incidences like Chernobyl and Fukushima could have been prevented. I feel it's time we get back into the harnessing of nuclear energy, since it would have a positive, drastic impact on the future of our country. It would result in the betterment of the people by drastically reducing prices and reducing our need for energy from foreign sources. And if things change and we are forced to move away from fossil fuels, it would be a highly efficient alternative that is ready to go for the benefit of all. If you like what you see here, please share the video and consider subscribing and being a patron. The Piper Report is an alternative news source that reports on news you won't hear from the corporate media, and a special thanks to my patrons. And I'm done.